This is Haftor Medboe of Copperfly, and you're listening to GMI.
Hello and welcome to GMI, the Guitar and Music Institute podcast, episode number 37. My name is Ged Brockie, and today I'm in conversation with Haftor Medboe. A leading light of the Edinburgh and Scottish jazz scene, Haftor is a prolific composer, an extremely talented guitarist and an educator. But today I'm going to be talking to him about a wide range of things, including his Norwegian background and his plans for a new record label. If this is the first time you've listened to the GMI podcast, then there's plenty back issues to listen to, and I would encourage you to go and have a browse through some of the amazing people that I've had the privilege to talk to in the other 36 episodes. A huge range of people, from guitarists to guitar makers and people involved in the industry. Just by listening to this podcast, you can get 15% of any of the products available to buy from the gmiguitarshop.com. We've got a wide range of products there. Just go pick the products you like, and at checkout add the code capital GMI01. Okay, now I'm not going to blether on too much at the beginning, folks, but let's get straight into it and listen to that conversation with composer, educator and guitarist Haftor Medboe. An Associate Professor of Music and Jazz in residence at Napier University, and unlike many of the interviews that I undertake, I'm actually in person with Haftor here in the bowels, or near the bowels, of Napier University. Haftor, hello.
Hello.
So, we're here in Napier. What is an Associate Professor?
As someone who hangs around with professors, it's kind of like, I guess in England they call it a senior lecturer, and we've moved towards associate professor, and it's the rung on the ladder before professorship.
Indeed. And does are you thinking about becoming a professor?
Well, it's more whether they will have me as a professor than whether I'm thinking about becoming one.
You don't seem dippy enough to be a professor.
Well, I'm getting there. And I've got the elbow pads, on the tweed jacket. Yeah, I've already bought the kit.
Yeah.
Obviously my goal is at some stage to go for professorship, but there's a few hoops to jump first.
Just for the listeners out there, and me in particular, what is a professor really?
What is a professor? It's somebody who's a leading researcher in their field that's internationally recognised and has an output of writing, the monographs and journal articles and the like.
That's something I would definitely want to talk to you about later. Just for the listeners around the world, perhaps you would like to give us a little potted history of your life, which is there's a lot in there. So. You're Norwegian born, but you've made your home in Scotland.
Yeah, I was born in Norway back in 1967, and my mother came to Scotland when I was 7, so I didn't really have a choice in the matter. And so I went to school here, and I've worked here, and I've kind of made my career and my friends and families and all of those kind of things here.
Now, I see, looking through all the artists you've worked with, you've really have developed developed that Scandinavian link. There's a lot of, in fact, almost exclusively Scandinavian musicians are the people you work with. Is that a cry back to your homeland in a sense?
I think it's a really interesting one. My whole PhD was kind of around those kind of themes of belonging and identity and culture and borders and the starting point for my PhD was what is a Norwegian guy living in Scotland playing Black American music? How does that all square or circle? And I think latterly, it wasn't always the case that I worked with so many Scandinavians. I used to work with mostly Scottish musicians because it was easier because they're in the same neighbourhood. But I found there is a way of thinking about jazz in the Nordic region, that is different. And I think at one point in my life, I kind of tried to move a little bit away from the American conception of jazz and try and find my own understanding of it. And it turned out that my own understanding of it was closer to the sort of Nordic understanding than to a British understanding.
So it's interesting. I mean, Nordic countries are, as a gross generalisation, quite cool, if not cold.
Well, they're very good. They're very good at marketing.
But I have heard it said that the music is in a sense cool or cold, and that there's a pushing the boat out here, a sense of being technically incredible, but perhaps lacking in emotion.
Yeah, I think I would argue with that. I mean, now I forget who it was, whether it was Jon Christensen, the Norwegian drummer, in an interview. He said, you know, the thing that links Norwegian jazz and American jazz is a sense of the blues. Now, a Norwegian blues is a very different type of blues to an African American blues, and it comes from a very different place. But there is still that kind of, there's a heart and soul to the music that has a sort of tinge of sadness, I suppose, in the same way that the blues does.
And emptiness?
Yeah, and emptiness. I mean, I guess you can look at, journalists like to look at the topography of Scandinavia and say, oh, it's all glaciers and deep lakes and high mountains and fjords, rather, not lakes, which I think is a little bit facile. And it's very easy to sort of to compare the music to the landscape, but
wouldn't that be a great? Isn't that the only thing other than climate that really defines us as human beings?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I can give you two little stories about that. One where I released an album that was reviewed by a Norwegian paper and also reviewed by the BBC. And the Norwegian newspaper said, "Oh, well, in this music you can hear the heather and smell the whiskey and you can see the barren landscape of Scotland and look, there's a ruined castle in the background." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And then the BBC, Max Reinhardt at the BBC, he described it as he said, it reminds me of driving through downtown Oslo in a blizzard. So I think people ascribe a lot of things to music that musicians don't themselves.
So they're just projecting.
They're projecting, or they're trying to put it. They're trying to make a sense of it. Yeah. And obviously, with a name like mine, it's Norwegian. And if I play gigs here in Scotland, it's always Norwegian guitarist or Norwegian Scottish-based guitarist. I mean, I've lived here since I was 7, so for 40 many years. On one hand, I feel quite Scandinavian still. I'm half Danish, so I probably visit Denmark a lot more than I do Norway these days, kind of twice a year probably. So I mean, I've got links there. And there are kind of things that you preserve as an expat, like the way you celebrate Christmas and birthdays and that kind of thing.
Are you more drawn to Norway or Denmark?
Probably more Denmark, actually. I mean, I've spent more time in Denmark.
The interesting thing is I actually watched a programme in Norway about a year ago. I really didn't know much about the country, other than it's pretty much like Scotland, but it's incredibly rich and Scotland isn't. And of course, in Napier we have another professional here who's from Norway. And one thing that came through from that programme was the poverty of Norway. And when it did eventually get its independence, so many people left. So I'm coming back to this emptiness about or sadness about the music. Is there any way that music can, that events can imprint upon at a genetic level the cultural surroundings, and that actually transfers itself through the music?
I hadn't quite expected this depth of philosophy. I mean, I dare say there is. I'm not sure that that's what we're talking about with Nordic tone or Nordic jazz or whatever you want to call it, as distinct from other European jazz.
But it does have its own flavour, doesn't it?
It does have its own flavour, but I mean, I think I've done a fair amount of research and done a lot of reading about the topic, and as I say, most of it is quite facile in that people like to just peg things, and and make easy associations. But, if you talk to... I remember reading a thing about Edvard Grieg, who's, he's the sort of national composer of Norway, I suppose, or was. Yeah. Even though his family was from Scotland. It's like,
yeah, and he did. He wrote the Hebridean Overture.
Exactly. And even in his time, he was... people were saying, but this music reflects the landscape of Norway. And he was like, no, it doesn't. That's not why I'm writing it. I'm writing about the human condition, not necessarily related to where I live or yeah. So, and I think it's the same. Talking to Norwegian jazz musicians, some of them never go up a mountain. They're either in the pub or in the studio, or on tour. So. I think there's a lot of things going on with Norway. One is technology. They've always been kind of at the forefront of technologies.
Nokia?
No, Nokia's finished.
Nokia.
But no, in terms of music making, they've always been early adopters. And if you think about the thing that defines the ECM label, which
I was going to bring that up,
well, which isn't a Norwegian label, funnily enough, it's a German label, but
it's got that stamp of Nordic on it, hasn't it?
He championed that kind of Nordic sound and in a way curated it, I suppose. So if we're going to be really disingenuous, then we could say that Nordic tone is a product of a Northern German. But so what Manfred Eicher of ECM and he worked with Jan Erik Kongshaug, who's his engineer in Norway. What they brought was a sort of classical sensibility to jazz recording, because they'd had associations with Deutsche Grammophon before, and they said, and I think they were of the view that if production levels can be so high for classical music, then why not for jazz? Because until then, jazz had always been recorded, around one microphone in a smoky room, and that was kind of part of the American authenticity story on it.
And was that really the big thing about the whole ECM invention?
Absolutely. And Kongshaug, who's sadly sort of very ill now, but he just received a Norwegian equivalent of a knighthood, and they had week-long celebration of all of the records that he's produced, and musicians came from all over Norway and all over the world to pay homage to the sound that he's created. So I think the sound world that Eicher and Kongshaug and others created, that drove musicians to play in a certain way, as much as anything else. And then you look at Garbarek, who's probably the most famous Norwegian musician. His roots are in Coltrane and latterly in what's his name? In Don Cherry and George Russell, both of whom were in Scandinavia in the 60s, and kind of took him under their wing and encouraged him to make a jazz that was more personal to him. Why don't you use Norwegian folk songs? Why are you using American songs? Why are you using American show tunes? Yeah? And so that all came out of there. So, yes, I think national culture has something to do with the story, but it certainly isn't the full story.
Pat Metheny famously said not so long ago that he worries that within 20 years the improvised art form will possibly die out in America. Do you think it'll be the Nordic sound will end up conquering the world?
No, I don't. The thing with Norway in particular, because when you talk about Nordic sound, you are really mostly talking about Norway. There's pockets of it in Sweden and pockets in Denmark, but Denmark and Sweden tend to look more to America historically than Norway does. Certainly in relation to jazz. I don't think there's a master plan to take over jazz culture.
Just by default, almost.
I'm interested. I'd be interested to find out what context Metheny said that in, because I respect him hugely as both as a composer and a guitarist and as an improviser, and I wonder what led him to say that, because it's not my understanding of what's going on at the moment. I think there's a lot of improvised music going on. The boundaries are blurring between genre, which I think is also an excellent thing.
And the only thing that's left?
Well, the only thing that's left is music. And we don't worry so much about whether we call it jazz or contemporary classical, or because jazz isn't the only music that is that uses improvisation. I'm not sure I agree with Matheny on that. But to come back to the
That'll
Nordic
be the
tone,
exclusive out there.
yeah, exactly. And I'll no doubt get a penned letter from him in the style of Kenny G.
Yes.
But I think that the thing about Norway, as you said, they are cash rich. They have the biggest sovereign wealth fund, I think, in Europe, and that's all based on oil that was discovered in the mid-60s, which they very cannily and very responsibly decided to only spend of the interest, which has left them with a huge pension fund, if you like. I mean, I read somewhere, and I don't know whether it's true, so don't quote me. But I think the story goes that everybody in Norway could stop working for 200 years, and it wouldn't really make much of a dent on their economy, which is an astounding fact. The other thing is that they've invested a lot in the arts. They spend under the previous government. It's now gone a little bit to the right, as all of the Scandinavian countries sadly have, if you're that way politically inclined anyway. But the previous government, which was more socialist, they were aiming for 2% of GDP to be spent on the arts. And I mean, it currently stands at 1% of the GDP. Now,
it's amazing, isn't it, when you think defence budgets are cut at 2%?
Yeah.
They're huge.
Yes. Exactly, and compare that to Scotland, where I believe that it's 0.2% of GDP.
That much?
Yeah. Well, I was surprised as well. But I mean, speaking to Creative Scotland, or folks at Creative Scotland, they said, even doubling that to 0.4 would allow them to do incredible things. So you can imagine what Norway has going for it there. That they can afford to fund touring. So any festival you go to in Europe, you will find a Norwegian band or two, because their travel's been paid, their hotel's been paid. There's a subsidy probably for the gig fee as well. Their recordings have been paid for by the government or subsidised. And this is a great thing. I might sound a little bit jealous here.
And what is that? Has that been impactful upon the lives of Norwegians generally? What is there any evidence that's looked at that amount of spending, which must be some of the highest in the world? I mean, generally speaking, in my experience, people are more engaged with culture and are healthier as a result. There is research on. Where is Norway on the happiness scale, Haftor?
I think Denmark always pips them to the post, but Denmark is always the happiest place to live. Maybe because you don't have to walk up and down hills all the time, and it's flat, and you can cycle everywhere. But I mean, all the Nordic countries score very high on the happiness scale. I mean, whatever that means. And it's not just about money. It's about the value of life. It's the balance between work and free time, and between cultural pursuit and technology pursuit. And it does seem like there's a better balance achieved, and it's at government level. But I mean, that said, it's what people call big government, I suppose. They're there for every step of the way. In fact, my cousin said in Denmark, if you fall off your bike, the state catches you.
So if so
you
much
never
money
even hit the pavement.
If so much money is being spent on the arts, has that brought the general? And this is a difficult one because it's all subjective, but the general ability of musicians upwards?
Absolutely.
Or do you just have loads and loads of rubbish?
No, absolutely not. I think, when you look at what comes out of Norway, which is a country the size of Scotland in terms of population, 5 million odd, the level of musicianship through the schooling that they have through Trondheim Academy and through the jazz unit at Stavanger and others, and the opportunities that those musicians then have, because I mean that's what makes musicians. It's the kind of gigs that they play, and it's who they're playing with, and where they're playing, and all of the things that feed in, and the experiences that feed in. I would say that of course that generates I've got to be careful here. I was going to say a better class of musician, but a more experienced musician certainly.
So we've talked a lot about Norway, but we've not really heard much about your work. Now, on your website it says you've recorded five albums, but that needs to be updated and indeed you've got a huge amount of body of work to come out soon. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit wrong actually on my website. I must update that. I think it's currently standing at 8 records that I've released, but and I've got and as you say, I've got a whole catalogue, a raft of new material just waiting,
including you alluded to it earlier, work that has been inspired by Norwegian folk song.
Well, actually, no. In this case, Danish from a small island on the south of Denmark, which is where I kind of spent my formative first years. And I've always had a very strong connection with it. And I speak the dialect, which is spoken by only about 2,000 people, so it's very niche and not understood in the rest of Denmark. So I found these beautiful songs that were, I mean, they're musical settings of poems by a poet called Martin N. Hansen. And it's different musicians from the turn of last century that have put music to them. And we've kind of we've repackaged them and retold these stories, if you like, in jazz language. It's quite sort of, it's a little bit Bill Frisell, it's a little bit kind of Esbjørn Svensson, it's a little bit, there's lots of space and a bit of free improv and to be honest, that's not fair. I was going to say not a lot of thought went into it. Actually, a lot of thought did go into it. We very carefully looked at what the songs were about, what the text was about, and took it very much from a melodic perspective rather than a harmonic perspective, to try and bring a new understanding of those old poems to the table.
And has it garnered much interest?
And not yet, because nobody knows about it other than you and now your listeners
and the listeners to this show. Well, that's
but it's really we're releasing it it was just recorded back in January here, so last month, and it's currently at the pressing plant in Plymouth, and it'll be on general release probably in June.
Do you have a favourite place to record, and do you go to gravitate towards any specific producer?
I mean, I've done a lot of my work has been at a studio just outside of Edinburgh in a place called Pencaitland, a little town, and it's an old schoolhouse that's been converted into something called Castle Sound Studios. And I think I've done the last 3 albums in there, but this new one we recorded in Copenhagen, partly to keep the cost down because the other 2 musicians were coming from Oslo and one of them lived in Copenhagen. And actually the studios are cheaper there now than they are here.
Okay, so will you be actually touring with this work?
I will be doing some touring with it. It's quite difficult to tour with the kind of musicians that I'm working with at the moment. I've got 2 projects on the go that are live, if you like. I'm working with a Swedish piano player called Jakob Karlsson, who's marvellous and internationally respected and tours most days of the year already. He's internationally respected and therefore commands a fairly healthy fee, which I'm quite happy for him to get. But but at the same time, without support, it's very difficult to afford to do the gigs. Yeah. So and when we do gigs, it tends to be weighted in his favour, which again I'm happy with, because it's getting the music out there. And with the other one, there's no touring schedule fixed yet, but we're going to be working on that for 2020 or 2020.
Well, that brings us a segue neatly in to a project which certainly raised my eyebrows when you spoke to me about it, which in this meltdown scenario we have in the music industry, you're actually launching a record label called Copperfly. Yep. Now that sounds exciting, it sounds mad. What makes Copperfly different?
Well, around 10 years ago, I guess, I started a label just when digital had become kind of the thing. And we still made CDs or produced CDs, and embraced digital download and all of that kind of thing. And I spent quite a lot of money setting up a website that meant that we could have control over our own digital download. What a waste of money that was, in hindsight. And
no one could foresee iTunes hoovering everything up.
No, exactly. I suppose we could have foreseen it, but it was that it was the whole idea of maintaining control over your stuff, over your intellectual property and that of others. But I mean, we had fun, and we released probably about a dozen albums by different people, my own stuff and other people's.
But Copperfly is not about digital, is it?
Copperfly is the opposite. So we now find ourselves in a different time, and I think it's the whole idea. Well, I mean, the CD I think is pretty much dead. Give it 5 years, I don't think CDs will exist, and I've never liked them as a format anyway. I mean, yes, sound wise they're fine, but the packaging is horrible, and those horrible plastic cases that crack as soon as you open them, and then CDs themselves are pretty tacky looking.
You don't feel like you're actually getting something, do you?
No, it feels cheap and plasticky, and even if you put it in a digipack and dress it up, it's still the same muck. And Apple have now stopped including a CD drive on their computers, or for a few years ago now, and I think people are swiftly moving away from them. I've certainly put all of my CD collection in the attic in the hope that one day it'll be a curiosity for my grandchildren.
Watch this, Granddad.
Yeah, exactly, the wax cylinder equivalent. And I think just the point that you made there, that you don't feel that you're holding anything. With vinyl, of course, we've always had that. We've always, looked back fondly to when you had something that had proper cover art, and you could turn it over and there'd be liner notes, and you could learn something about what you were listening to, and then just the physical activity of putting an album on a turntable and cranking it up, and not cranking it up, turning it, pushing the on button.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not that old either. But, and then putting the arm carefully on, and that moment where the needle hits, and it's all terribly romantic. Now, and that sort of coincides with where we're at now, where vinyl is increasing its sales year on year. I mean, that said, it still only accounts for 7% of the market, so it's niche. But I'm certainly, in my own circle, everybody has a turntable now, and it's
even if it's USB.
Yeah, but people are tending to go for old school, or a nice Riga planer, or investing a bit of money.
I remember doing a gig at a hi-fi convention in Bristol, and it was just. That was just Haftor having a slip of his coffee, folks. Yeah. I couldn't believe it. This convention, we were playing a little gig in it. It was about over 8 floors, and it was just crammed. And there was all these guys. It has to be said, mainly in brown corduroy trousers, with their mums, aged 45, going around looking at all the stuff. That wasn't the case, folks, but it was just an observation. But I just couldn't believe how massive hi-fi was, and that was about 8-9 years ago. And
when you look at the 7% sales figures for vinyl, that doesn't take into account second-hand vinyl, which is a huge market. I mean, here in the UK, we've got Oxfam, who specialise in second-hand vinyl, and all second-hand shops have vinyl in the back. Now, if you add that to the equation, I think we might find that vinyl's somewhere around 12%.
So what are the plans for Copperfly?
Well, the plan is to retain control. So we have a single point of sale, which is the website. Or if the artists are gigging, obviously they're selling at gigs. But
so it's not just for you, Copperfly?
Currently it is. Because I'm kind of testing the waters before I start throwing money at other things. So I've got 3 albums that I'm bringing out over the next 6 months. And the idea is to bring one out every 2 months. It's a very, very sort of conservative business model, in a sense that we're going for limited edition release, 250 limited edition of each recording. I mean that might change depending on the project, but certainly we want to keep that limited edition, the exclusivity factor, and so in terms of the profit that can be made on each release, it's very limited. But at the moment, you're making nothing, or I don't know anyone in the jazz world that is making money from digital streaming. Maybe 10, 15 quid a year or something like that. So
that much?
You obviously sell more streaming than you do. $14.99, I think it was. And unless you're gigging furiously, selling CDs is also very difficult. I mean, nobody buys them for online anymore, really.
Do you think from a marketing perspective, the vinyl's a good idea because people just want to have something if they go along to a gig, and it's a memento in a sense.
Yeah, and it's big enough to sign by the artist. They like that as well.
Funnily enough, one of the previous podcasts was with a great guy called Andy Squires. He's a singer-songwriter based in Leeds, and Andy is doing a great trade in vinyl. He uses the CDs just to give away, but sells vinyl. Got them made up in Germany, company, and that's where a lot of people are going now, aren't they?
I really believe so, and I think if we can't shift 250 units of each release, then we're doing something wrong, like horribly wrong. So I'm fairly confident that we can make it work. I mean, where I'd like the model to go is that we have a pre-order system, which means that the album is paid for before it even goes to press. So in a way, a little bit like Kickstarter or something like that. But we want people to have trust enough in our brand that they'll say, okay, I want a copy of the next album. I know there's only 250 of them. I'm going to get in early, and hopefully we'll get to a stage where that's the case.
And from an economical point of view, does 250 presses make economic sense?
I mean, I don't mind sharing the figures at all with your listeners. It costs me another kind of niche thing about what we're doing is we're releasing on 10-inch vinyl rather than traditional 12 or 7-inch. It's a really nice format. It's slightly easier to carry. It's got a sort of coffee table vibe to it. It looks really nice. It does mean, though, that you've only got 20 to 23 minutes worth of music on each cut, which, again, is a conscious decision that there's no filler on any of the releases. It's all just like top-drawer recording, So if you record an hour's worth of music, you condense it down to 20 minutes. You just take the good stuff. And the other stuff, can be released as bonus tracks on the bundled digital download. Because we offer that with the vinyl as well. You can then go and download it from our site, but from nowhere else. It won't be on Spotify. It won't be on iTunes. It won't be in any of these places. The deal that I'll be doing with new artists is that we have the rights over the 250 units, but they retain the digital rights 100%, and they can release it on Spotify or wherever they want after a year.
Okay.
And once we've had a bite of the cherry.
And is it cheaper then to go for repressings once you've had your?
No, and we don't intend to do repressings. I mean, the whole thing is about there are only 250 of these in the world, and you either have one or you don't have one.
So what are the economics of it then, Haftor?
So if we sell all 250, we make about £1,400 on a release. Right. Which is very little money, but compared to what one might make on CDs or certainly on digital streaming, it's a lot of money.
So how does that work? I take it have you been telling other people about Copperfly yet, or is it really just?
It's very new because technically it's not even launched yet. The first album comes out on the 5th of April.
What's that album?
And that's the one that I've made with Jakob Karlsson.
What's his name?
It's just called Us. I should have called it. It's just called Us. No, it's called Haftor Medboe, Jakob Karlsson, so self-titled, if you like.
Right.
And it's 4 original compositions of mine. And then, as I said, the next one in June is going to be with a trio with Gunnar Halle from Norway, trumpet player, and Eva Malling from Copenhagen, doing these Danish folk songs. And then the third one is a complete sort of left turn or right turn, which is a children's jazz album that I've been writing, to try and kind of fill the gap of jazz for kids. And it's aimed at 2 to 5 year olds, and we're recording it in a week on Saturday with Scottish musicians.
And is that anything to do with the fact that you're a newish father?
Yeah, it is, but and I think that's brought it back into focus. But I've always wanted to write a children's album. Again, there's a sort of tradition of that in Scandinavia that jazz isn't considered some sort of cerebral thing for adults only. It can also, kids aren't scared of music in the same way that adults are scared of music, and so they're more open to ideas. So what we've done, or what I've done, is I've written songs about things that 2 to 5 year olds think about, like getting up and getting dressed and going out and about and having a bath and all of those kind of things, and friends and
jelly and ice cream,
and all of those kind of things, and I've written quite simple melodies, but with quite sophisticated adult chords, if you like. Yeah?
So it's not 12-tone serialism.
No, not at all. But that said, they're actually remarkably difficult tunes. I mean, they're kind of written in a 1950s jazz style. They've got a lot of bop changes going on underneath it, and the melodies, although they sound deceptively easy, they modulate a lot.
So are you the Carol Starling of the...
Who's that?
The cartoon music for Tom and Jerry.
Oh, God, no, nothing like that. No, much simpler than that. But I'm really excited about it, and we're going to... I mean, I think we're going to release that one as vinyl. That's certainly the plan at the moment. But we're also going to release it as a website, because I've got an animator working on a kind of standalone thing that features all of the music.
So how are you going to get... The hardest thing with all these, it all sounds fantastic, but it's getting the message out there.
Absolutely. I mean, press is everything for us at the moment, because nobody knows who Copperfly is, and in fact, if you type it into Google search, you'll find some fly fishing company in the States that isn't us. So I've for each pressing we reserve 50 for press. So we get 300 pressed and 50 go to press, and then there's an additional 100 go out to press digitally as EPKs. So I'm trying to hit 150 high quality international press, and the idea is that if they review the work and we get onto the radar of audiophiles and vinyl junkies, that it'll just tick over. Obviously, the other way to shift units is at gigs. Yeah. So for Jakob Carlson and I have 2 gigs coming up over the summer. One for Glasgow Jazz Festival, one for Edinburgh Jazz Festival, and then we're playing in Denmark in the fall. I was going to say
all of Denmark.
All of Denmark. No, we're playing a festival in Denmark in the autumn. So that's 3 gigs, and I reckon we can probably shift 30 albums per gig, so that's 90 right there. And I haven't really done a projection on it that I can trust, but I've been around long enough to know that I think I'm comfortable with the spend.
It sounds incredibly exciting, and I wish you all the best.
Well, thank you. I mean, it is exciting, and at the same time, it's kind of frightening because there is a bit of investment up front.
Now, I want to talk about yet another thing you've been spearheading. I'm right to say that you're heading this up, called SGA, the Scottish Jazz Archive. What's that all about?
What's that all about? Well, I mean, this has been kind of ticking over for a couple of years. Some elderly gentlemen approached me, 5 of them. Well, actually, no, there was only 3 left because two had passed away by the time they got to me. And they were kind of looking for fresh young blood, which was hilarious because I'm 52 or 51. But it's always nice to be called a young man. And then set up an organisation called Edinburgh Jazz Archive, and it focused very much on traditional music, on traditional jazz in Edinburgh, between kind of the 1950s and the 1970s, or 40s and 60s actually. And, I mean, I love my traditional jazz as much as any other flavour of jazz. I don't play it particularly well, but I don't mind listening to it. But it's not really my sort of central thing. So I said, well, I'd be interested in joining and helping the Edinburgh Archive and bringing it up to date and trying to reflect the whole breadth of jazz history. But then we got to thinking, or I got to thinking, and realised that Scotland really isn't a very big place. It's Glasgow, it's Edinburgh, and the other cities, Dundee and Aberdeen, and a little bit of activity in rural areas. But for the most part, jazz has happened in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So why not just have a Scottish Jazz Archive? And I think, for me, the urgency of setting up an archive is that a lot of that generation that made the jazz scene what it's become now, back in the 1950s and 60s, are getting on, if not gone. And some are suffering from dementia and the rest of it. And if we don't get their stories now, nobody's going to remember.
So it's a case of interviewing these people and having.
So the center, what do you call it? The central aim in the first instance of the archive is to do an oral histories project with that older generation and capture their stories, around which we build a kind of digital repository of photography and text and audio and that relates to their stories. Yeah, so we're kind of, I guess we're letting them tell the history themselves rather than somebody else imposing their history on them.
Perhaps at the cost of sounding insolent, who's going to be interested in this?
That's a good question. There's a lot of interest in it. For example, there's a website or not a website, a page, a Facebook page called Lost Edinburgh. I don't know if you're.
Yes, I am. It's amazing.
It's amazing, and people put up an old photo of.
In fact, I saw a photo, the first ever photo the other day. They said it's 175 years ago, which would make it around 30 something.
Yeah.
And it was 3 guys getting drunk.
Oh yes, I saw it.
Yeah, and apparently the photographer took a photograph the next morning of one of the guys who was getting drunk, and that's the first ever photograph of someone with a hangover.
There you go. There's been a few, certainly of me since. So there is that interest in history generally, and I think what can make a jazz archive interesting is if it can intersect with what else was going on at that time. Yeah? So, the venues, the pubs, the kind of people that were going, what the political climate was at the time, what society looked like. And that's very much what we're kind of going for. And that's where I think the oral histories will really help, because they're kind of animated snapshots of history. Yeah.
I remember talking to a Scottish jazz singer called Fiona Duncan.
We've already interviewed her.
Yeah, and she told me, I don't know if she'll have said this, but she once told me she went on one of the ferries over to the Isle of Rothsay, I think it was, and she was playing there 6 days a week, and on the 7th day, this is almost biblical, they got in a car and they got the ferry back to the mainland and drove up to Wick for a gig.
Yeah.
And she told me that she was making more money in the 50s in a week than her father was in a
year.
Was it in a year?
Yeah, I mean, it was something crazy like that.
Yeah.
I mean, she also told us that in the interview, which you can see on the Scottish Jazz Archive website, it's just scottishjazzarchive.org, she talks about when she was playing in the Cavern Club in Liverpool, and the interval band was the Beatles. and then she goes on to say that one week they went down to play and the queue was all the way up the street, and she was like, "Oh, we've got really famous," but it turned out that the Beatles had got really famous, and she said, and that was it for jazz. It was good night. So I mean, there's all these really interesting stories that also intersect with rock history and popular music history. So I think there's a lot of people that will get a lot of different things out of it.
Now, one of the great dangers of this project is leaving people out.
Absolutely, but it's going to be very community driven. So what we've done is we've identified sort of interest groups around Scotland who are all feeding in, and we're not saying no to anything. Yeah? In the first instance, everything will relate to the oral histories that we've made.
So what is the filter, Haftor? I mean, who decides if someone is a jazz musician or not?
Oh, there is no filter. I mean, if they're perceived as a jazz musician by anybody, they're a jazz musician. Yeah?
Okay.
And their contribution might be small or great. We're certainly not in the business of curating history, and saying this person may pass and this one may not. Yeah? Because that if you look at American jazz history, that's been that's the uncomfortable part of that history, is that there's so many people that were really great players that have been forgotten, which, we're quite happy to put everybody on the same pegging, yeah.
So when will this? It's the website's already up.
There's a kind of beta website up that's not very sophisticated.
Is there any sort of dates that we should note?
Not at the moment. I mean, we continue to sort of trickle feed the website with we've got a lot of materials already that have been donated from far and wide, and we're in the process of digitizing things and meta tagging it and trying to make sense of the collection. We're in the process also of setting up as a charitable organisation, which will allow us to apply for funding that I can't, as an academic, currently access. Yeah. So I'm hoping that the next year is going to be, the year where things really get started. Because with these kind of things, you need money, because you need expertise and, infrastructure.
Okay, we're coming to the end now. A couple of things I just wanted to flag up, which I didn't know much about. The first thing is you have written quite a lot of music for film and television.
That's kind of it's in my past a bit. I did some stuff for Channel 4 and for Turn TV, and I did a lot of short films.
Did you just enjoy playing guitar too much?
No, do you know what it was? I found that world didn't understand music in the same way that I understood music, and I got kind of sick of trying to explain myself to them, And they generally wanted something that sounded like something else that they couldn't afford, so they wanted me to do it for cheap. And I got to the point where I thought, well, if it's composition that I love, and I also love playing, then why not just write for my own band? And that's satisfied that need in me.
So we started the interview off talking about education, or at least the fact we're in an educational establishment.
Indeed.
And I thought it'd be nice just to end on this, which is that you have been working or delivering the Napier Jazz Summer School. We're into the 23rd year, is that?
Yeah, it must be at least that. To be honest, I've a little bit lost count. It's certainly over 21, and it might even be 24 years now.
So that takes place every summer?
It takes place every summer in connection or conjunction with the Edinburgh Jazz and Blues Festival, who kind of support us, and they give us free tickets to students each night, so that students can go out and actually hear some proper jazz, and then come back and have another go at making it themselves the next day.
So what is the format of your summer school?
It's a 5-day intensive. We keep it very reasonably priced to encourage people from all walks of life. It's open to 14 years and up. I think the oldest we've had to date has been 82. And it's a really good a good mix of age and gender and nationality, and people come from all over the place.
How long is a day?
A day is from 10 till 4. We take a break at lunchtime, but by the Friday, it's a Monday to Friday. On the Friday, they do a gig as part of the jazz festival, and by then they are wiped out. It's very, it's intensive, but at the same time, it's very inclusive and it's very fun, and it's really about enjoying the music rather than saying that there's a correct way of playing jazz or that you must know this in order to qualify as a jazz musician. It's really just, playing with the building blocks of it. And it's changed a lot over the years, because it used to be a little bit more kind of Berkeley-esque or Ebersold, very kind of, the do's and don'ts of jazz. And now for example, last year the repertoire that we featured was all written by Scottish musicians, which was really nice. And there was a lot of free playing in there as well, and encouraging them to just ignore harmony and modes and scales and just make texture and sound. And so it's really evolved, and I think it's a really exciting little school.
Haftor, it's been an absolute pleasure interviewing you. You're doing so much in your life, and you've done so much in your life. It's been great to have you on the GMI podcast.
Well, thank you, Jed.
Well, that wraps it up for another GMI podcast. What do you think of Haftor's plans for his new record label? Sounds pretty exciting to me. It'll be interesting to see how it goes when you're selling only vinyl. There's no doubt that vinyl sales are going through the roof. I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to listen. Wherever you are in the world, it's great to look at the podcast statistics and see so many listeners from America, Japan, Germany, and of course from throughout the nations of the United Kingdom. It's great to know that people are out there and listening It helps me ensure that there will be more podcasts coming up. But the very fact that the audience is growing. Please tell others about the GMI podcast and let's get that audience even greater. So, until the next podcast, which will be coming your way really soon about something specific to do with guitar or the guitar world, all that remains to be said is, for me, Ged Brockie, thanks for listening. Bye for now.